Hello, welcome to this week's reflections on the Revelation to John. We finished up last week talking about the dragon or the ancient serpent, the beast as described to figure out the remote past that comes to haunt the future, yet ultimately it is doomed to destruction. So therein we find hope, even though John hears that the beast is and was and will rise again. Ultimately there's destruction. So he found hope there. The seven churches are to find hope there. We are to find hope there. And that's where we stopped at verse 8. If you haven't already, under this video, if you'd click on the subscribe button, I'd appreciate that. And maybe even give me a thumbs up if you found these videos helpful. If you have any thoughts, concerns, questions, you can leave them in the comment section below these videos on the YouTube channel, and I'll get back to them as soon as I am able. So we are at verse 9, and now the angel continues the explanation with a little bit of a challenge. He says, this calls for a mind with wisdom. And just a little reminder for us that wisdom comes from God to the faithful. So the beast's 7 heads, the angel claims, is the 7 hills on which the woman sits, also verse 9, and at the same time 7 kings. So in the symbolism of this book, the book of Revelation, 2 different symbols can represent the same reality or different realities for one symbol. For example, both the 7 lamps before the throne and the 7 eyes of the Lamb represent the 7 spirits of God. Here, one symbol represents 2 distinct realities, the 7 hills and the 7 kings. So the angel speaks something of a riddle. The 7 hills are the first clue that Babylon is Rome. For this notion that Rome was built on 7 hills was already current among Latin poets. More important is the second part of the interpretation. The 7 heads are also 7 kings, of whom 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other is not yet come. Yet when he does come, he must remain for a little while. The beast who once was, now is not, is the 8th king. 8 of 7. I'm not saying this all makes sense by our logic. But he belongs to the 7, even though he's the 8th. And he is going to his destruction. So this appears to be a restatement or something that's tilted in a rather political direction. Once was, now is not, will come out of the abyss and go to his destruction, verse 8. So more than any other passage in the book of Revelation, the interpretation of the 7 horns as 7 kings has fostered the notion that John saw the beast as a kind of reincarnation of the Emperor Nero, whose brief yet very gruesome persecution of Christians in the year AD 64 was very vivid in Christian memory at this point. The passage also has figured prominently in efforts to date the book of the Revelation to John. Identifying the 6th king, who is, verse 10, would supply an approximate date of composition for the book of Revelation. Unfortunately, don't jump right to that. Unfortunately, that identification is not possible. No one knows with what emperor the series of 7 begins. Now, there's plenty of folks out there over 2,000 years who have said, oh yeah, I've got it all figured out. But they don't. They're speculating based on something they interpreted out of the book. The identification of who starts the 7 is unidentifiable. It's not possible because no one knows which emperor is the first in the series of 7. So how to count the 3 emperors who all reigned in the years 68 and 69 leaves it open-ended. Which one of those 3 begins this series of 7? We don't know. John didn't say. Nobody is still around from that period to tell us. Everything is speculation at this point. So it is true that from the late 1st century, one popular superstition held that Nero would return after his death to take power again. And you can go back to chapter 13, verse 3 to see some of that. In identifying one of the beast's heads as an 8th king, who nevertheless belongs to the 7, verse 11, the angel probably alludes to the superstition, not to endorse it as true, rather to make the point that the only figure from remembered history for the readers, the original readers, to whom this beast might be compared is its cruelty to the people of God, which was the ill-fated Nero. So the point is not that the 8th king is Nero, reborn or reincarnated, or however you want to phrase that. Rather, the 8th king is like Nero in his character and in his destiny, in his evilness, if you will. So it's not saying it is Nero, it's saying one like Nero. So the possible allusion to Nero has cast a shadow on many commentators' interpretation of chapter 13, whether in reference to the one of the beast's head that seemed to have a fatal wound, but its fatal wound has been healed, chapter 13, verse 3, or in the much discussed number 666, chapter 13, verse 18. Yet it is important that we keep in mind the angel is not explaining chapter 13. The angel is explaining chapter 17, specifically verses 1 through 6. Even though the 2 visions have one major character in common, that is the beast, they should not be jumbled together in some kind of they're both the same. They're not. They're 2 visions. So it cannot be assumed that Nero reborn, the legend, is the key to interpretation of the beast's wounded head in chapter 13. Remember, the beast is introduced in chapter 17, as if for the first time, not a reintroduction. Its previous escapades in chapter 11 and 13 seem to have been separate illustrations. So at most, it is possible the mysterious 666 at the end of chapter 13 was intended in some way to anticipate the more complex and more political application of the figure given here by the angel. Although for the most part, the vision of the present chapter is new, not a rehashing of something old. It must stand on its own. 2 important conclusions can be drawn from the angel's words. The first is that the Antichrist, if we may borrow that term, is in a general sense the 7-headed beast. And yet at the same time, the 8th head, or the 8th king, who somehow belongs to the 7, in other words, the Antichrist in Revelation is both an institution and a person. Remember I said one symbol can represent 2 different things. Or it could represent an empire as well as an emperor. So the second conclusion is that the Roman emperor reigning at the time that John wrote the book is not this Antichrist. Although the presupposition of the entire book is that the time is near, according to chapter 1, verse 3, and then later in chapter 22, verse 10, it is not a present reality to chapter 17. according to the scenario of verses 10 and 11, the sixth emperor is, and the seventh is yet to come. And when he comes, he will remain for a little while. Only then will the dreaded eighth emperor, perhaps modeled in character after Nero, will appear on the scene. So the angel makes it clear that the vision concerns the future, not the present, not even the immediate future. Although John may have remembered the three emperors within a single year, again, the years 68-69 AD, the likelihood is that the angel was pointing to an interval of as much as a decade or more before the final conflict and the destruction of the beast. So the interval is just as visible in the next phase of the angel's interpretation. The 10 horns of the beast are the 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, yet who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast, according to verse 12. The word kingdom here is defined by the phrase authority as kings. At the same time, John writes, the 10 are not yet kings because they have not yet received kingly authority. Like the seventh king and like the eighth king, they belong to the future. And they too will hold sway for an unspecified time, represented by the phrase 1 hour. Again, let's not get literal here. We're talking about symbolism. So these kings have one purpose. Instead of receiving their authority from the beast, as we might expect, they give their power and authority to the beast, as we would not expect. Where does this authority come from then? Well, we're not told specifically, well, at least at this moment. So remember, we need to read these as if we're reading everything for the first time and we're understanding everything for the first time. We don't have the hindsight of already knowing how it turns out. So unlike the 7 kings of verses 9 through 11, the 10 kings represented by the beast's 10 horns are not presented in a series. They seem to be a confederation or an alliance, probably the same alliance identified earlier as the kings from the east in chapter 16 verse 12, or the kings of the whole world gathered for battle at Armageddon in chapter 16 verses 14 through 16. Armageddon, in fact, seems to be in view in the angel's pronouncement that these kings will make war against the Lamb, although the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of Lords and King of Kings, and with the Lamb will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers, according to verse 14. This is the first explicit indication that believers will participate with the Lamb in his victory over the power of evil. Although they were provisionally victorious over the beast in their deaths, chapter 15, verse 2, here they are participants in the final victory, presumably at a place called Armageddon. 2 qualifications must be noted. First, the victory is primarily the Lamb's, not the followers. For the verb will overcome is singular. It refers to the Lamb. The Lamb will overcome, not the followers. And Christian believers are mentioned almost as an afterthought. Second, the words called, chosen, and faithful are conditions for participating in the victory. And there are 3 separate conditions. They're not synonymous. Called, chosen, and faithful are not synonyms. Each is more specific than the one before. First, they are called, compared chapter 19, verse 9, when we get there. Then not only called, they are also chosen. You can see Matthew 22, verse 14. And finally, not only chosen, they are also faithful, as in chapter 2, verse 10, be faithful even to the point of death. So there's three things here: called, chosen, faithful. So the participants mentioned in, only kind of as an afterthought, have to meet three separate conditions. So the purpose of these three adjectives is like that of the 7 messages of chapters 2 and 3, to encourage John's readers to be faithful, that is, to overcome. And you can compare this kind of language to chapter 16, verse 15, in the immediate context of the kings gathering at Armageddon. In chapter 16, we were given the setting of the battle only, Armageddon, which, as we discussed then, is an unknown kind of location. Now we know the outcome, and now we begin to understand how it comes about that the 7-headed beast will finally go to his destruction, according to verse 8 and verse 11. The angel's account of the 10 kings and their ill-advised alliances with the beast is interrupted by an abrupt mention of the many waters, where the woman was seated, according to verse 1. So these waters, the angel tells John, are not literally liquid water. They are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. So again, we're talking about a metaphor or symbolism. This is another step toward interpreting the woman herself. Just in case John missed the reference to the 7 hills, the many waters identified her at first as ancient Babylon. See Jeremiah 51:13. Although this new angel now reveals that they are only a metaphor or a symbol. The woman is not an ancient city literally built beside many waters or canals, rather the city of John's own time with many tributaries, that is, with many nations and races of people accountable to it politically, culturally, and economically. So the identification becomes explicit in verse 18. The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth. So by this verse, by this time, the identification is no longer necessary, for every reader has figured it out. They now know who this woman is. It is made explicit only in the to give immediacy and to force to the repeated announcements of the woman's doom in the next chapter. The clarity of the identification makes it impossible to argue that the book of Revelation is written in any kind of code from Roman officials, what Revelation is about, because the Christians in Asia Minor thought of Rome as this beast, or really the woman riding the dragon. So no Roman citizen could read verse 18 and have any doubt that the prophecy was intended as an oracle against imperial Rome. They knew, as well as any reading Christian would have known, the great city that rules over the kings of the earth was Rome. Nothing could be more explicit than that to the first century readers. So into this explicit identification of Babylon, the prostitute, as Rome, verses 15 and 18, the angel weaves a continuation of the count of the 10 kings, now in relation to both the beast and the prostitute, verses 16 through 17. For the first time, dissension is evident within the ranks of evil. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh, and they will burn her with fire. So just in these few words and in the brief 1 hour of the king's alliance with the beast, the destruction of Babylon is accomplished. The entire next chapter will be given to a bittersweet celebration and mourning or grieving, if you will, of her gruesome fate. The destruction of the beast and its allies will come later. So before revealing the identity of the prostitute, the angel supplies one crucial piece of information about the 10 kings. The expression, they have one purpose, in verse 13 is now explained, so that we now learn the true source of their authority. The angel tells John that it was God who put it into their hearts to accomplish God's purpose by agreeing to give the beast their power to rule until God's words are fulfilled in verse 17. Behind this unified purpose of intention of the kings is nothing less than the sovereign purposes of God, the Almighty. With this, the angel anticipates the end of the vision when he says, "These are the true words of God," chapter 19, verse 9, the final verdict from above on all that John has seen and heard. Earlier, it had seemed that the forces of evil had summoned the kings to the battle at Armageddon. John has seen 3 evil spirits that looked like frogs coming from the mouths of the dragon, the beast, and the false prophet. These John has identified as spirits of demons performing miraculous signs, going out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle of the great day of God Almighty. That's according to chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. So now, as John is allowed to look more deeply into the same events, John is reminded of the sovereignty of God, controlling even the thoughts and the purposes of the enemy. So this so-called dualism of the book of Revelation, we now learn is an illusion. For the vaunted powers of evil are merely pawns of a righteous God whose power is still unchallenged. Armageddon turns out to be a trap, and God has led them straight into it. Sounds kind of gruesome, and some modern readers find the book of Revelation offensive because it presents God as the author of such grotesque horrors as are described in this chapter and in the next. There is a school of thought, if you will, that we need to shock those believers who have become complacent in how they view God. Some have become so complacent with God that they keep God in their box, that seeing God as anything outside of their box will be to them unacceptable. Flannery O'Connor, American writer from the mid-20th century, saw clearly that, as he stated, any Christian writer, even a writer of fiction, will find in modern life distortions which are repugnant to him, and his problem will be to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural or normal, I might say. And he may well be forced to take even more violent means to get his vision across to this hostile audience who may not want to accept it. He says you have to make your vision apparently by shock. To the hard of hearing, you shout, and to the almost blind, you draw large and startling figures. Kind of sounds like what John's doing in this vision. So that takes us to the end of chapter 17. If you've not already done so previously, maybe you want to take time to pause this video and read or listen to chapter 18. Chapter 18 is going to talk about the bright angel's announcement. So the interpreting angel, that speech ends with chapter 17. Suddenly that angel is replaced by another angel coming down from heaven. This angel has great authority, and the earth was illuminated by his splendor. That's why we call it the bright angel. He recalls the mighty angel John had seen long before, coming down from heaven, robed in a cloud, with a rainbow above his head. His face was like the sun, and his legs were like fiery pillars. The two do not have to be the same angel, yet they are alike in the sense that they are radiating a visible brightness, and consequently the authority of the sovereign God they both represent. Now, the angel here is not explicitly said to be mighty, so we're not talking about God here. We're talking about an angel representing God. So he does speak with a mighty voice. He speaks as if speaking for God, which gives them a mighty voice. So with the coming of the bright angel, the time frame changes. John has been hearing the fall of Babylon, or Rome, predicted as a future event, according to chapter 17, verse 16. For the present, she is still that great city that rules over the kings of the earth. Now suddenly, it is as if John himself is transported into the future, where John can look back on the city's fall as something already accomplished. So we're having little, back to the future kinds of visions. The message is a familiar one. Fallen is Babylon the Great, because all the nations have drunk the maddening wine of her adulteries. So there are two new elements here: a glimpse of that city's utter desolation and a view of what she has lost. Rome's desolation is painted in colors taken from Isaiah's description of the ruin of Old Babylon. You can see Isaiah chapter 13, verses 19 through 21, or the destruction of Edom. You can see in Isaiah 34, verses 11 through 17. Rome, the new Babylon, has become a home for demons, a haunt of every evil spirit, a haunt of every unclean and detestable bird. In a strange way, the grim announcement dramatizes the point that the earth was illuminated by the angel's splendor. The message he brings: bad news for Babylon, good news for the earth. The word repeated, translated haunt, also means prison in Greek, while the word foul, as in bird is a fowl, is literally unclean in the Greek. In that sense, the bright angel reveals the truth about the world's evil forces. The message that Babylon will become a haunt or a refuge for unclean spirits and unclean animals and birds means that the rest of the earth will be free of all of these such kinds of things. They will all be gathered to Babylon. In particular, the three frog-like unclean spirits that led the kings to assemble at Armageddon will trouble the earth no more. The work of conquering unclean spirits, which Jesus began when he healed those who were demon-possessed and continued in his resurrection, ascension, and journey to heaven, are now complete. The stage is set for rejoicing over the earth's purification in the destruction of Babylon or Rome. So the second new element in the bright angel's announcement is its emphasis on the economic power of the fallen city. Not only has she made the nations drunk and practiced immorality with the kings of the earth, but the merchants of the earth grew rich from her excessive luxuries. With this, the angel's oracle of judgment ends, leaving the impression that Rome's real crime is not her drunkenness or sexual immorality, rather it is her acquisition of wealth and luxury through trade and economic alliances with a host of client states and cities. Drunkenness and morality, however bad it is, turns out to be simply metaphors for Rome's economic, consequently religious imperialism. I'm going to stop us there. That takes us through chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. I know that seems like a very short 3 verses for a long definition. Next time we'll pick up at chapter 18, verse 4. If you're in the Sun City Center area this Sunday, you can join us in person for worship at 10 a.m. If you're not around for that, you can join us on our live stream at 10 a.m. or you can watch later as a recording. I hope you're having a great week. Take care. God bless.